Hello, class, and welcome to our video lecture on Muslim American women on campus. Is the title of the book, and the chapter that appears in our textbook selection is Muslim American Women in Campus Culture. So, again, the idea that culture and society is directly involved in this analysis from, again, the standpoint of identity and stereotyping and the different causes and effects that relate to that. So the good thing about the situation is that the chapter of the book is available online. So I'll put the links at the bottom here of the document that we're going over together so that we can work through it. And when you click on the book, it has the look inside, view inside, excuse me. So this particular excerpt comes from chapter 2 and the chapter is titled Muslim American Women in Campus Culture. And again, I want to remind you of the definitions of identity, right? Sense of self, condition of a character, and the notion of stereotypes, and how a simplified and standardized conception or image invested with a special meaning and held in common by members of a group. So let's specifically look at this document from the standpoint that it's not just looking at the culture, it's also looking at it from a perspective of the Muslim community and the dominant non-Muslim community, right? That a young female Muslim in a post 9/11 America experiences double scrutiny. And again, I believe this relates to identity, and this also relates to stereotyping. How ethnically diverse American college women, all identifying as Muslim and all raised in the United States, construct their identities during one of the most formative times in their lives. So on to the reading from our textbook, chapter 2, right? Notice how the parallelism of that first sentence. Notice how the use of the colon here to separate the subtitle. The first sentence reads, for undergraduates, college is a life change that can be exhilarating, terrifying, and confusing. What a great sentence to start the chapter off and to establish the topic of this paragraph. And then they're very specific, the writer is very specific in the details about how it's exhilarating, how it's terrifying, how it's confusing. Specific examples, details, just as your paragraph should contain clear topic sentences and then provide those details, those examples. Notice the citations. It's an academic argument. And I like how the idea of a lens is also present at the end of the first section of chapter 2. The experiences of Muslim American women serve as a distinctive lens, just as we examine our essays and our documents, our secondary sources through the lens of rhetorical analysis. She's saying the experience serves as a distinctive lens whence to examine the social spaces of American campus culture. Let's start with Latifa, an effusively Cherub Arab American freshman trying to find her way at Georgetown. Notice how they the author invokes the ethos of Latifa. Just as you want to bring in specific examples representative of ethos, of authority, of credibility, we see the same occurs here with the example of Latifa. Marginal identities on campus. It's right, limited liberty. I like the alliteration there in the first part of the subheading for the chapter. It starts with a quote from Latifa, and then, right, college is properly visualized as a world of freedom, mobility, and move this up here, right, and personal maturity. This is where girls become women and boys become men. Again, this notion of identity, continuing to examine identity and the stereotypes that Muslim American women have to deal with, and those causes and effects of those double standards, of those hasty generalizations, of that discrimination. Throughout the paragraphs, right, very specific in how Latifa is going to be used as an example. We notice how in the next section, sociability and hedonism and college peer culture, again, just as you'll be focusing on culture and society, so too does this academic argument, this carefully structured research. And I want to call your attention not just to the overall argument, but the specific development of the body paragraphs as evidence of academic argument, which is a strategy that we too can emulate when constructing our own body paragraphs. Let's take a look at this one here, right? In American popular culture, college at the corner of adolescence and adulthood. I like that analogy, right? That description, just like you're kind of in between two streets and you're not sure which one, you're at the corner, right? College is when young people are at the corner of adolescence and adulthood. A select mimicry of adult hedonistic behaviors combined with youthful imprudence. Interesting. Undergraduates are customarily described as being frivolous, right? And then we have the quotes and descriptions of various frivolous behaviors to explain the description presented in the topic sentence. Now let's go to the next paragraph. Peer culture constitutes marginality for many who are ugly, uncool, frumpy, unpopular, non-white, foreign, or poor, with important regional and rural urban variations. Quote unquote, cool students are or seem mellow or blasé in relation to, well, everything. Notice the use of the colon before setting up the list of the things that people are blasé or very nonchalant about. So again, this notion of social behaviors is also examined with relation to stereotypes and identity. The next section, goes on college peer culture and unauthorized or informal policy. Again, this notion of identity work, looking at the unfortunate perceptions that lead to stereotypes. As it moves forward with the argument, right, continually mentioning the policies, continually creating the academic argument, the carefully structured research as it builds towards the conclusion with the list, if you would, the chart of the various stereotypes. Here we have the construction, if you would, of the identity. In social encounters, the Muslim and the non-Muslim are both aware of a set of notions about Muslim traditionalism, fanaticism, anti-modernity, xenophobia, violence, and gender oppression. All results, effects, if you would, of stereotyping and the negative effects of that with regard to identity. In that shared psychological space, battles are won and lost, but the accusation hangs in the air and the power differential remains, right? When an Arab or African American is essentialized and assumed to have an essential, unchanging, fundamental core identity, right? I mean, and again, it's not just talking about Muslim American women, it's going beyond that and looking at stereotypes in general for Arabs and African Americans. For example, being prone to fanaticism or violence, the awareness of this stereotype can inflict symbolic violence and inwardly reduce the stereotyped individual. Just as the various readings we have analyzed and evaluated regard to identity and stereotypes, we can see here, just like that idea of the stereotype threat, now this notion of the stereotyping gaze is brought in, right? The stereotyping gaze manifested through a fearful glance, a racial slur, a snide joke, or a thoughtless remark exercises power over stereotyped persons. Looking at those effects. specifically and very vivid description with adjectives. What kind of glance? Fearful. What kind of slur? Racial. What kind of joke? Snide. What kind of remark? Thoughtless. What kind of gaze? Stereotyping. Notice how the adjectives help to develop the notions in the sentence to make the nouns more specific with regard to the focus on identity and stereotyping. Again, the next paragraph, notice, right, how this paragraph, ends with these specific examples, and then that transitional sentence, the truth about people of color and their supposedly essential identities. And notice how essential is in italics, right? And then look at the transition here, right? This last sentence transition to the topic sentence of the next paragraph. Among these essentializing stereotypes, Orientalist stereotypes project Muslims and Muslim societies as racially and religiously homogeneous and predictable, and the opposite of the West, right? And then there's more descriptions of how these stereotypes are perpetuated and have negative effects. It's just such a well-developed academic argument. My Muslim American female participants continually encountered in the gaze of the other this conviction about Muslim women's inferior status and underdeveloped personhood. Again, the academic argument continues to examine, right, the effects of stereotyping on Muslim women's identity. And as we move towards the conclusion, right, again, notice the Rogerian argument. I mean, every topic sentence is just extremely clear and effective in announcing what aspects of identity and stereotyping, negative effects the paragraph is going to focus on, right? It really is just a well-constructed argument for us to emulate. Notice the Rogerian strategy here with the idea of bringing in other groups who are stereotyped based on their identities. Notice this idea, identities are socially constructed rather than inherent, essential, and unchanging. And I think that this paragraph right here is very indicative of this notion that we're examining in the paper, socially constructed, right? Our behaviors are not a pure manifestation of some inner unchanging core, and that social interactions result in complex combinations of identities that moreover change in composition to different environments, right? Change in composition, again, in context. Socially, we engage in people's opinions of us and with others' views on acceptable behavior. No one is entirely free to be who he or she wants to be. We are wrapped within a matrix of social connections, roles, personas, rituals, and expectations that blocks entire worlds of possibilities. What a really interesting and clear way to put it. And I like how these ideas of identity are related to roles and personae and rituals and expectations. So as we move forward to the conclusion, right, notice how they repeat the point in that final kind of paragraph of the chapter leading up to the chart of stereotypes. Muslim American women regularly experience such identity silencing demands on campus. The kind of final paragraph leading in towards the stereotype chart, which kind of wraps up the chapter selection in our textbook, also reviews the supporting ideas, right, as it's kind of leading in to the chart, which does a nice job of summarizing the stereotypes themselves, right, and how they are damaging because they negate the diverse identities that need to be embraced and celebrated, as opposed to the stereotypical identities that are projected upon people with those quote unquote attributes that are considered normal. And we can see that here. So again, as you're bringing your arguments together, you want to review your supporting ideas clearly mentioned here in the chart. You want to repeat the point and reflect on the bigger picture issues, right? While Christian Americans are typically unaware of the existence of racism or of covering demands on racial and religious minorities, right? And that's a really interesting point, right? White Christian Americans are typically unaware of the existence of racism, and that's or of covering demands on racial and religious minorities. And that's the whole point, is that people need to be aware. People need to be educated. And when you're reflecting on the bigger picture, right? In your conclusions, as you're bringing your essays to a close, make sure that in addition to repeating your point, reviewing your support, you're also reflecting on bigger picture issues and how it relates to culture and society, and how we as humans can learn from your analysis and your evaluation and your responses to construct an academic argument that shares your perspective through carefully structured research on identities and the damaging effects of stereotyping. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching and listening. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.